Today we have with us Mr. B.G. Verghese. B.G. Verghese started his career in journalism with the Times of India and was later editor of the Hindustan Times 1969 to 75 and in Indian Express 1982 to 86. He has been with the Centre for Policy Research since 1986. He was Information Advisor to the Prime Minister 1966 to 1969, a Gandhi Peace Foundation Fellow for some years after the emergency and Information Consultant to the Defence Minister for a short period during 2001. He was a recipient of the Magsaysay Award in 1975 and a SAMS Sankar Dev Award for 2005. Verghese has served on a number of official and unofficial boards and committees and continues to be associated with a number of NGOs in the fields of media, education and the environment and community relations. He is chairman of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, Delhi, and a distinguished fellow of the Administrative Staff College of India, Hyderabad. Verghese was a member of the Kargil Review Committee and co-author of the Kargil Review Committee report tabled in Parliament chronicling the sequence of events leading up to the India-Pakistan confrontation and recommendations for the future. He was also a member of the Editors Guild of India Fact-Finding Mission to Gujarat in April 2002. With a keen and enduring interest in developmental reporting and the social transformation it can help bring about, Verghese has authored several books including the seminal Design for Tomorrow early in his career following an extensive tour of the country and its infrastructure projects, Waters of Hope, Harnessing the Eastern Himalayan Rivers, Winning the Future, India's Northeast Resurgent and Reorienting India. Rage, Reconciliation and Security deals with managing India's diversities. His latest book, a personal memoir and Worm's Eye View of India, first draft, Witness to the Making of Modern India, was released by Tranqueber in October 2010. Schooled at Doon School, Dehradun, India, Verghese went on to read economics at St. Stephen's College, Delhi University and Trinity College, Cambridge. Verghese was born in 1927. He resides in New Delhi. Concerns about the media industry's prioritizing profits over public service has historically given rise to proposals for a more professional model of journalism education. In the context of neoliberal restructuring and a professional crisis in journalism, there have again been proposals for journalism education to help uplift professional journalistic values. This program offers a critique of these recent journalistic ventures and examine whether journalism is business or profession. The advocates of professional journalism schools also hark back to traditional journalistic ideals and notions of objectivity, which some critics argue contributes to public apathy and damages prospects for participatory democracy. This episode will conclude by exploring recent journalistic course of action for critically evaluating the action of journalist or press as such vis-a-vis various episodes in the history of Indian journalism, reporting and so on, which overcomes some of the problems of professional reform model in journalism. Over to Mr. B.G. Verghese.
Business is important in the sense that both the individual as well as the organization, the agency, whether it's a newspaper or a channel or whatever, radio station, needs to make money to pay its way and to continue in business. Because it is a costly business, you have to have equipment, premises, staff, and then you have to send out people to get the news, whether it is reportage or film or whatever it is, and then edit and present it and so on. So, and you're not confined to one city unless you're a purely local newspaper or local station, but you are maybe regional, provincial, national, international. Therefore, you need to have the resources to be able to hire people, good people, and equipment and staff, and to enable them to do the work that they are trained to do and which you require of them and which viewers and readers expect. So there's no question that it has to be a business. But is its primary motivation merely to make money like any other commercial business? Or is it imbued with other values of serving the people? Now, in our Constitution, as in most constitutions, there is this very important value of freedom of speech and expression. That's Article 19 in our Constitution. And freedom of speech and expression is a shorthand, or has been expanded by usage and by court rulings and so on internationally, to include freedom of the press, which means freedom of broadcasting as well, freedom of other kinds of expression for the filmmaker, for the writer, for the artist, for the citizen, to speak and to express themselves. And this is the two-way thing, to be able to reach out your message and to receive messages from other people, whoever they might be. It's a two-way process. And therefore, this is something that is very, very valuable and precious. When a baby is born, what's the first thing that it does? Cries. That's freedom of expression. What it means is, I've arrived. Take note. That is a very important thing. That's the very first thing it says. And in a sense, freedom of speech and expression, while they rank with all the other fundamental freedoms listed in our Constitution or in the Human Rights Charter or the UN Convention of Civil and Political Rights or economic and social and cultural rights and so on, is in a sense not superior to any other right, but in a sense is the first freedom, because without that freedom, all the other freedoms become in some ways handicapped, because other freedoms also need to express themselves in some way. How do you form an association, freedom of association, a trade union or any other body? If everyone comes and sits silently and cannot write, how do you communicate? There's no association, just a gathering of individuals. So unless you express yourself, you cannot communicate. And that's the whole basis of society, communication. The classic case of this in our context was during the emergency when we had censorship. And the censorship was subject to guidelines which had been issued by the government. Now, these were challenged. And they were challenged, among other places, in the Gujarat High Court, where the court ruled that these guidelines were ultra vires of the Constitution and were to be struck down. And the lawyer appearing for the particular client said that unless you make special arrangements and issue special orders, your order will also be censored, and no one will know that you have struck it down, and therefore it is illegal, at least in Gujarat state. And that's precisely what happened. That order was censored, with the result that nobody knew about it till much later, and censorship continued in Gujarat. So without that expression in some form, the mischief continued. As I say, why is freedom of expression so important? Because it is the basis of any society. All living sentient beings communicate. Animals do, through their calls and cries and so on and so forth. But what makes society, what makes community is communication. And that is expression. And if it is curbed, then that society is somehow crippled in whatever way, through its artistic expression, through freedom of political views or of ideas and so on and so forth. Now, in earlier times of civilization, it was thought that these were gifts, freedom of speech and expression, were gifts given by the rulers. And the rulers, and since science had not advanced very greatly and there was a great deal of superstition and belief in the supernatural, it was the kings and the clergy ordained what was right and what was wrong. And therefore, you had only the right to freedom of speech that was given to you by the king and allowed by the clergy. Now, when the scientific era gathered momentum during the Renaissance, you had people like Erasmus and Galileo, which said that the earth goes round the sun. Now, this defied the Christian belief, and maybe the Islamic belief, in creation. God created the world, and that everything else followed. This idea of it being, of the earth going around the sun, was anathema to the church, and therefore he was excommunicated. 500 years later, about 10 years, 15 years ago, the Pope publicly apologized, saying that the church had been wrong. Well, it's good that he did it, but 500 years too late. But the world had gone on. So the question is whether you're to be ruled by the fiat, by the whims and fancies of kings and of the clergy who interpret the scriptures. And all the scriptures of all faiths rest in imagination, because the scientific basis for it wasn't known. But through symbols, they arrived at certain, what they thought was the truth of how there was creation, how people came into being, how societies grew and developed, and what were the rules that should regulate that. It was something that was man-made and gifted by God. Therefore, you had the divine right of kings. Now, all that changed with the Reformation and the Renaissance and equivalent movements in other parts of the world, where the age of reason, you reason things out, and you establish the facts as they were made known through scientific inquiry and through reasoning, and you then set the rules, society set the rules. And therefore in this, the power of expression, the freedom of speech and expression became the vital central point of any social political organization. And this, as I say, extended to artists and musicians and writers and singers and architects and anybody, and man and woman on the street. Now, if you again look back, you've all done history in school, and you'll find that espionage, spies, were very important, because you needed to gather information, because if you had superior information, you knew who was creating mischief in the kingdom, or conspiring against the king or the rulers, and what your enemies beyond your boundaries were planning to do. And therefore, you sent out spies, and you executed other fellows' spies, because they were penetrating your defenses. And from this derives the phrase we all use, that information is power. So this is the root importance of freedom of speech and expression. Now, everyone has the freedom of speech and expression. You and I can go out of this college or even here and say what we want. And maybe if we offend somebody, we may get beaten up. If we offend the law, we may find ourselves locked away. But we have that right. And the Constitution, our Constitution, as most constitutions, says, while there is freedom of speech and expression, it's Article 19, it's also subject to Article 19.2, which follows, which says there can be reasonable restrictions on freedom of speech and expression, and on grounds of sovereignty of the state, national security, public order, incitement to offense, contempt, friendly relations with foreign states, privilege, privacy, and so on. List varies, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. And this, in a sense, has been added to through court interpretation, so it's been widened. And our courts, as most courts, certainly the Indian courts, the Supreme Court, has always tried to widen the ambit of what freedom of speech and expression means. Now, what does reasonable restrictions mean? The word reasonable is important, because the obverse would be that it is an unreasonable restriction. It is arbitrary. Anyone who has the power lays down the law and says, you shall do this and you shall not do the other. And then it becomes a subjective thing. If it suits me, it's all right. If it doesn't suit me, then you better shut up, or I'll cut off your head. Now, that doesn't work except in authoritarian societies. So, reasonable meant it cannot be arbitrary. And to adjudicate this, you could go to courts and say that the order passed, the law passed, or whatever it was, the action taken was arbitrary, it was unreasonable. And the courts could then pronounce on whether it was arbitrary or not. And if it was unreasonable, it would strike it down. And a number of laws and actions of the governments and others have been struck down by our courts to ensure that the freedom of the citizen is not unduly curtailed in an unreasonable fashion. So now everyone has the freedom of speech and expression. But we can talk as a community here. But the people in the next seminar hall or the classroom or the next building, or those studying sociology or Urdu or mathematics in the adjacent building, won't know what we're talking about, though obviously we think it's the most important thing we're talking about. And they are wasting their time on their mathematics and physics. We are talking about things that really matter. But how do they know? They only know if they're able to communicate. Now, one way of communication is you've got a loudspeaker on top, and you broadcast this. And anyone who can listen will hear it. And therefore, you have communicated to a wider audience. But that is still limited to a small radius. And therefore, you go one better. You print it in a pamphlet or something, and you circulate it. And earlier newspapers were of that nature. They were pamphlets, and there were books. Newspapers followed later. And they had commentary as much as news. But that also was limited because of the ability to circulate physically. And somebody, unless it was given away free, you had to buy it, and so on and so forth. Then modern means of technology and communication expanded this further. And you got the telegraph and the radio and the printing press and the camera and now the computer, the chip, the satellite, the cell phone and everything else, so that we live in an instant world. Anything that you say or do can be instantly communicated to everybody else, anywhere, including photographs and so on and so forth. And the cell phone now is the quickest and most instant form of communication, even more than the channels or anything else. Now, that's where the media comes in. Now you have the power, therefore, to inform, and information is power. But that power must be used with responsibility. You can't go wild and say, I have information, so I am now king. I'll do what I want. I'll abuse somebody because I don't like him or her or them or the regime or the other country or whatever it is. And if somebody is my friend, then whatever the wrongdoings might be, I will cover up. That would not be fair, and that would injure the interests, the other interests and rights of other citizens. So this is a very valuable collective right that the media is the trustee and custodian of. So when you set up a newspaper, a radio station, or a channel, or whatever else it is, you have a responsibility not merely to yourself, because you're involved, but to the society that you serve, your readers, your viewers, your listeners, your audience. And the audience these days, as I say, can be global, and it's instant. Therefore, you've got to abide by certain rules, which are not necessarily written down, but by sense of values, which are internalized. It may be externalized in the sense of the law, reasonable restrictions. But then there are many things that go beyond that, matters of interpretation. How do you interpret it in a particular situation? What should you do? What should you not do? Therefore, you have to internalize certain values of what you think is right or wrong. You may have codes, a newspaper ethic of its own. You may have codes of conduct of various kinds. You may have a regulatory framework beyond the law. You may have bodies like the Press Council or the Editors Guild or the Journalists Association or whatever it is. And these are all means by which others also, at a higher level or more detached, can regulate what is going on to see that the things don't go out of hand, everyone doesn't go wild. So this is the form of regulation that takes place. But within the newspaper itself, it is the professional sense of worth of the individual, the writer, the editor, the reporter, the cartoonist, the photographer, whosoever, the designer, that goes into it. And collectively, you do something, and your neighbor say, "Arey, ruk jao, this is not right. Think about it. Have you consulted the other people? Have you got the other side? Is it a fair and balanced report that you're presenting? Or if there's a photograph, have you edited out certain portions that leave out something that you think should not be there, but which is germane to the story and which the public would want to know? Have you highlighted something else just to focus on a particular person when that was one among 100? Why is it that you're doing it? What is your motive?" So these are questions that you yourself ask. Now, one of the great issues of modern journalism, particularly in this instant world with instant reach, the moment you say or do something, it's around the world instantly. And you feel the competition is there, and if you don't do it, the other fellow's got it, and everyone, your editor and your viewers and your readers, what a nincompoop this fellow is. This is not the right channel. We switch to the other, or the other newspaper, or the other reporter, or whatever it is. Therefore, you have to act with speed. But that does not mean you act without restraint. It doesn't mean you act without due thinking, and by abandoning all values. Dekha jayega. Publish and be damned was an old phrase that was used. That is not the proper approach. And it's very important that we should know what all the sides are and what all the factors are if you want to present a true and accurate account, as far as we can, of what is going on. Now, what then is the truth? It has many sides. And in a complex world of politics, economics, society, love, hate, conspiracy, war, diplomacy, many emotions come at play. And your emotional state of mind is important. So the reporter has to interpret this and not jump to conclusions. We have trial by the press, which is an awful thing, a lot of it. We've had the Arushi case and so many other things where gross injustice has been done to people because you jumped the gun. Shot the film, showed it, got a quote, gave it, and it's published and be damned. But who is damned? It's the other person, some innocent person. And you intrude into people's grief and privacy. Horrible sights. You get some, accident or a murder or a terrorist case, and somebody will go to the sobbing mother or the wounded husband or whatever it is and say, "What do you feel about it?" It's extraordinarily insensitive. It's an intrusion into private grief. It's got nothing to do with freedom of speech and expression. It's just bad journalism. But because we want to sensationalize things, we sometimes do that. Now, why I say all this is because these are the professional aspects, the ethic or the values of journalism, which we cannot lose sight of merely in order to do good business. Good business in the sense we must have enough money to run our affairs and pay our salaries and get our raw film and send people out for shoots and get an OB van or to publish supplements or whatever it is, send somebody to the Olympic Games in Beijing. All this costs money. All of it may be in pursuit of very legitimate news. Therefore, you have to earn in order to spend. Therefore, the business part of it is important. But business cannot be so important as to jettison all ethics and values and say, I want business plus. And the plus is to be that I've got to get 3 increments and I've got to earn as much as, I don't know who's the leading star these days. Is it Karisma Kapoor or Bipasha Vasu? Or is it Amir Khan? Or is it Shah Rukh Khan? Or Tendulkar? Or now Avinav Bindra? We've got to get crores and more. Therefore, what is it we're talking about when we say it has to be a business? What kind of business? Business to keep ourselves afloat, to do a good job, to have good standards, good equipment, pay our people well, enable them to travel, get them books, a good library. All those things are essential. But do we go beyond that? And at what cost? Money is not a bad thing in itself. It's how you earn it and also how you spend it that matters. That's where the trouble comes in. So there's nothing wrong with making money legitimately and spending it sensibly and well. So the business ethic also comes in, and you've got to make a judgment as to where you balance these things. So you have to, keeping that in mind, is it journalism, business, or profession?
Most recently, in the wake of a professional crisis in journalism, educators in India and the world have argued that journalism schools should imbue future journalists with strong professional values. Journalists are working under greater stress with fewer resources, and media conglomerates, advertising and marketing priorities are increasingly taking precedence in many for-profit media organizations' newsrooms. The professional reformists advocate for traditional journalistic values based on a liberal theory of democracy. However, this model of journalism is criticized by a number of scholars for allegedly contributing to public apathy. However, further research would be required to establish the viability of critical journalism pedagogies in the light of the constraints faced by journalism programs and in light of the challenges such as curriculum would pose to the doctrine of objectivity and the liberal assumptions embedded in much current Indian journalism education.